Most organizations have to reach the point of outlining, for purposes of transparency and sometimes for organizational integrity, outlining those things that it believes are the rules that they're going to operate under as a collective. This includes decision-making rules, etc. But one of the most critical elements of this is the idea of developing bylaws or some form of structured rules. Interestingly enough, the experience I've had working with cancer coalitions and other kinds of coalitions is that when you first start out to form a coalition, people start talking about bylaws and rules. They quickly become very complex and complicated because people are trying to minimize risk that things later will go on. It's far better, in my opinion, and it has worked far better for most coalitions I've worked with, if you start out keeping the rules very simple in the beginning, and then you expand them as you need to and as circumstances dictate, rather than trying to anticipate every terrible thing that might happen and creating a rule to manage it before it ever happens. And very often, quite frankly, some of those more draconian things that might happen never do anyway. Coalitions are often confronted with the question of whether or not we're going to incorporate or not incorporate. Incorporation involves a process. It is a legal process of becoming a legal entity. And one of the most fundamental reasons for creating a legal entity is the possibility of fundraising. That is, you have to have an agent to be able to accept the funds, and creating a corporate structure allows you to do that. On the other hand, the other part of an incorporation is to make sure that you create status for the organization as well. That is, you are a living entity, etc. But fundamentally, one of the really important questions is decide, how long does this coalition have to exist? If you're there for a short-term item, something that you're going to do within a year or two, you may not want to incorporate and find some other way to deal with the fiduciary issues. On the other hand, if you think it's going to take 5, 6, 7, 8 years to do something, then you might want to consider incorporating. Incorporation also covers one other possibility, and that is it provides basically some cover for organizations to participate in a larger entity. So one special organizational consideration when thinking about coalitions and organizational members is the role of government and what government can actually contribute to a coalition and how one would want to manage their participation. One of the things that I think is really important is the more an organization decides it's going to get into the advocacy arena, the more people get a little antsy about government engagement, and that's mostly coming from the government side, not from the other organizational side. And that's because there are rules about what government can do in an advocacy environment. So one of the things that I think is really interesting to me is to watch and look at the different ways different people play roles in coalitions. So for example, some organizations are there who can play advocacy roles, and that's what they do. Other organizations like government may not be able to do that, but they do a lot of other things that are fundamental. Many of the great databases in the country that we have that give us the information to fuel our interest in certain kind of interventions come from government. And so government can always contribute the information that's in the public domain anyway to the work of a coalition. They certainly may not be able to go out and stand on a legislative lawn and ask for a vote on something specific, but they can play that strong educational role and make sure that the coalition doesn't get off track by misinterpreting the data or overinterpreting the data. Coalitions over time go through cycles. They go through cycles of success. Then they kind of get a little stale or maybe a little dry. They start losing members sometimes, et cetera, and constantly having to rejuvenate. Sometimes the mission focus changes. Sometimes circumstances outside the coalition dictate that they take positions on things they haven't before, that they may be uncomfortable with. The important thing to recognize, though, is that it is a bit of a roller coaster. And so as you think about how coalitions are going to work and what makes them work well, et cetera, this idea of constantly revisiting and looking at who you are is important. Equally important, though, is the constant reminder of what our goal is and what our mission is. Why did we come together in the first place? There were some interesting studies done in the early 1990s that actually shows that the average person, talking about an employee now in an organization, actually can't remember the mission of the organization after 90 days. That is, we get mission drift. So one thing that makes coalitions really effective in this regard is to every single time they get together, stop and remind people, why are we here? What are we doing? What's our mission? So that part of drifting doesn't happen because it's constantly there every time. Good leaders will make that happen. So leadership succession is a really critical issue. Many coalitions form around a nucleus of people, very passionate, maybe highly respected and revered, to sort of take up the gauntlet of leading an organization through its beginning stages, etc. But over time, some of those leaders move on for other reasons. Sometimes, quite frankly, they stay too long. And so one really critical element of success in coalitions is to make sure there's a very clear succession plan for leadership. And this is extremely important when a coalition is dependent on one or two people, and perhaps have been for years, to actually make themselves function. There comes a time when everybody has to move on, and helping people move on by having clear succession plan and term limits, etc., is really important.